Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about how I mix blue without using blue and how this works by talking about some more sort of intermediate colour theory. And then I'm going to explain why this can be useful and how I utilise it in my own paintings. For the purpose of this video, I am going to assume that you already know basic colour theory, that you already know primaries, secondaries, what complementary colours are, and how to neutralise complementary colours and things like that. Just for the purpose of this video, if you don't know those things, I suggest that you go and check out some basic colour theory and then come back to this video, because if I tried to cover basic colour theory in this video as well, it would probably end up turning into like an hour-long course. So we're just narrowing down to the sort of more intermediate concepts in this video. I'm also limiting this video today to mixing blue. I was originally going to explain how to mix blue without blue, red without red, and yellow without yellow, and this is possible but difficult. But I decided to just start with blue for this video, and then I can always make a red video and then a yellow video at some point. The reason I'm starting with blue is because of a concept I'm going to be explaining in this video, which is colour identity. Blue retains its colour identity the easiest out of red, yellow, and blue. So if you don't know what I mean by that, do not worry, because I'm going to be covering it in this video. And I also apologise for my voice. I am recovering from the winter season and all of the lovely health issues that brings. So, right, let's get into the chart that I have here, and then we can get into some colour mixing. I'm actually going to do some live demo colour mixing for you. So this colour chart here has been arranged with red, and then we've got red purple or purple red, purple, blue purple or purple blue, blue, blue green, green, yellow, yellow orange, orange, red orange, and then back to red. And the way that this particular colour wheel is set up is that the most saturated or the most chromatic, depending on which word you like to use, chromatic or saturated, the most saturated version that a colour can be is on the edge. So the most saturated purple would be up here, and I'm just dropping my pens everywhere, and then it becomes more neutralised as we get closer to the centre until we reach black. So if I'm just going to use the red section here as an example, our most saturated red that we can ever achieve is at the edge, and then here we'd start getting muted reds, and then as we go further down we start getting red earth tones, and then we start getting warm greys, so very, very grey reds, and then we get black. For the purpose of this colour chart, what I'm saying is black here is actually Neutral Tint by M. Graham, which brings me to my next point, actually, which is that something we start to come across once we break away from basic colour theory is that we are limited by our art materials. And this is most evident in traditional. There is a little bit more leniency with digital art, but you do still come across some limitations even in digital. For the purpose of the video today, though, I'm going to talk about the limitations of traditional art, which is that we can only reach the most saturated colour based on the most saturated pigment we have for that colour. So along the edge of this chart here, I have the most saturated pigments of each colour that I have from my watercolor collection. So if we were to try to theorize a perfectly saturated green, realistically it would be even more saturated than the actual pigments that I have. So when I'm actually painting, I'm thinking about these as being my upper limit. These are the most saturated I can get. Next, I'm going to talk about colour identity. Colour identity is what a colour registers to us as. So when you look at these colours here, your mind goes yellow. These retain the colour identity of being a yellow. These have the colour identity of being red to us. When they start to become more muted, sometimes they will retain the colour identity. They will still be perceived as red or as purple or as blue, even when they start becoming more muted. But some colours, especially yellow is a very good example of this. As soon as it starts becoming more muted, it very, very quickly registers to our brain as not yellow anymore. It loses its colour identity. And yellow does that very, very, very quickly. Pretty much as soon as you, if I cover up the colour wheel, as soon as you start getting into like this territory here of muted, it starts just looking like an earth tone, and then it starts looking brown or muddy or grey or icky very, very quickly. Red, a really good example of the colour identity thing with red, is that if you're working in opaque mediums and you were to add white to red, it starts to look pink. It loses its colour identity as a red, and it takes on a new colour identity in our perception as being pink. But blue, out of red, yellow and blue, blue retains its colour identity for the longest in going down from here to black. Even the most muted of blues still register as a blue to us. So this is one of the easiest ones for me to start with in talking about how to mix primaries without them, because of just how much room you have to mix a blue and for your brain to still perceive it as a blue. So that kind of covers colour identity a little bit there. If you want to know more about colour identity, I really recommend researching and digging into that even further, because it is a fascinating topic. I am going to talk about it a little bit more in the practical applications for this towards the end of the video though as well. Okay, so I have got here dioxazine violet, PV23, which is here, swatched on the paper, and then I have PG7, which is phthalo green blue shade, which I have swatched here. I am going to try and keep as much of the actual mixing on screen as possible and in the actual video footage as possible, so that you can see and know for certain that I'm not cheating. I'm going to use these two just to show you straight away that you can mix blue from a purple and a green. And I'm going to show you some others as well. So as you can see, just put down dioxazine violet here. And now I'm going to take phthalo green. Again, just to prove that is phthalo green. Going to start here with a slightly more blue-green there, so we're getting more of sort of like a phthalo turquoise. And then I'm going to add more and more purple to it. So it gets very, very dark valued, but this is a blue that you can mix very, very easily from just a green and a purple. You can get some variation by having slightly more purple. So we have slightly more purple here. And it starts to become more of a warmer blue. So if I were to give rough equivalents, this would be slightly similar to like a Prussian blue, and then this would be slightly similar to an Indanthrone blue. Now I'm going to explain how this happened. I love showing it first then explaining it, because I like seeing and hearing that. What's going on? I know that I'm not going to actually hear it from you as you're watching this video, but I like to think of it in spirit, that you are thinking, what's going on, when I did that. I'm going to have to shoop this round a moment. What I did there was I mixed phthalo green blue shade, which is this one here. So I'm going to put a little dot on it, which is a blue leaning green. And I mixed it with dioxazine violet, which I put here, which is like a bluish purple to me. It registers as a bluish purple. Now, when I do this, this is not perfectly scientifically placed. I'm just trying to illustrate vaguely what is going on to you. Where is my ruler? There it is. What I did was I mixed these two together, a bluish purple and a bluish green. I mixed those two together, and what I was able to achieve were blues along this line. Again, this isn't perfectly scientific in terms of like exact measurements. I'm just trying to vaguely show you what's going on. So these blues are not as chromatic as the blues on the edge of here. Again, as I said at the beginning, they're more chromatic up here, and then as we get closer and closer to the center, they start to become more and more neutralized, more and more muted. So we're going to produce more muted blues than these blues up here. These blues up here are ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, phthalo blue green shade, and then phthalo turquoise PB16. This is the single pigment version. And we are not, as I said, going to get as chromatic, as saturated as these. They are still going to register as blue, so I'm just going to focus on these as they're drying. I will also, once they're dry, put up a picture of them on screen for you now so that you can have a proper look at what they look like dry. So what's happening here, now that I've let these dry a little bit, I can actually put things down, is when we're mixing using the dioxazine violet and the green, we are essentially removing this chunk of the colour wheel being accessible to us. And that means that we only have the blues available in this range. And that is part of how we develop what's called a colour gamut, which I am going to talk about after we do the colour mixing. But for the purpose of this section, just view it as like slicing off that range of blue being accessible. And the same can be said when we start to mix with a pigment even further away. So you can mix phthalo green with quinacridone violet, for example. So this is PV19 violet. And we start to get blues that are along this range, so even more muted. Now, they do still register as blue, especially if you utilize the idea of a colour gamut in a colour palette. And that will make more sense when we get to the section on creating colour gamuts. But for right now, view it as, again, slicing off this section of the colour wheel of being accessible to us. I've just moved the wheel up here because I'm working with a limited space. And what I'm going to do is I am going to show you this blue again. So same blue. And we have what it looked like for the first mix, and then this side was a little bit more purple to it. And I'm going to put it next to Indian Throne Blue. So this here is Indanthrone blue. Just to illustrate how similar the blue we're able to achieve without a blue being present. Now I'm going to show you some other mixes using the same idea as well, and then at the end I'm going to scan this and actually put it on screen so that you can see it properly, because I know that lighting can obviously affect our perception of what it looks like on screen. So the next one I'm going to do is going to be a example with the, shall we do the PV19 since I mentioned that? So this is quinacridone violet. This is quinacridone violet PV19. I'm going to put some on the page here. And I may as well start labeling as well. It's probably best that I do that, especially if I'm going to scan this for you all. So these two were PG7 plus PV23. This is PB60. And this is PV19 violet, because there's PV19 rose as well, so I want to specify that. So we've got the PV19 violet there. And I'm going to bring out the same green again. So we've got the PG7 phthalo green blue shade, and I'm going to add it in. A little bit too much green there, so it just registers as green at first, but if we bring back that violet again, just keep adjusting it. This is the thing though with mixing like this, you do have to do a lot of mixing to kind of figure out the blue that you're trying to look for. I'm going a little off screen. Oh, there we go. That's starting to look more like a muted bluey green. So a little bit more. A little bit more. And so like I said, this is going to be even more muted than these ones, just because we're working further away from blue. And the further away from blue we are, technically speaking, the closer we're getting to its complementary colour, orange. So if we have our blues here, and the green, the blue-green and the blue-purple are very close to blue. It's literally in their name, right? Blue-purple and blue-green. And I know I put phthalo green by green here, but they're still very close to the blues. But if we move further away, we're starting to get closer and closer to blue's complement, which is orange. So this method works best when you're working close to the colour you're trying to mix. But blue, because it retains its colour identity for the longest, even in its most muted versions, has the most lenience in how far away from blue you can go. It does start to become more of like a Payne's grey, kind of bluish grey, but it can still be used as a blue in a limited colour palette where you're utilising comparative colours and comparative colour theory, which I will be covering in a moment, but I want to show some other examples as well. So let's move away from PG7 and look at, I don't have much left in this, but this is PG18, which is Viridian. So So Viridian is a similar hue to phthalo green blue shade, but it granulates. Okay. Which one do I want to do with that? Let's do the dioxazine violet again. So try and remain on screen, dioxazine violet. Now, I'm having to be very careful how much violet I use with this because Viridian is not as strong as phthalo colours. So I'm just going to be a little bit careful. So with Viridian, again, because it doesn't have the same intensity as phthalo colours do, it's going to produce like a softer blue, but no less pretty. And again, it's going to have that green granulation going on in it. Let's get that really, really wet so that you can really see the granulation. And while I do that, I will do some labeling. Okay, now this is dry. And I added another one in here, which is Viridian and quinacridone rose. And as you can see, this is starting to push it now. This more just looks like a cold grey. And that is because if we were to look at this colour wheel again, this is PG18 here and quinacridone rose is all the way over here. So when you're going from green all the way over here to your magenta colours, and the rose specifically, so that's magenta there. If we're looking at the rose, we're starting to get into the very muted end of these blue segments. We're starting to get to the greys. So they're still cool leaning because they're still in the blue segments, but they're very much starting to get just to grey territory. But I wanted to show this just to compare it to the other mixes as well and kind of show you how you can get more vibrant blues when you're closer and then how they become more muted as you move further away. And I will put a scan of this on screen for you now, so that you can refer to it before we go into the next section, which is how this is useful in painting. And for that I want to talk about two things because they both relate to each other at the same time. So I'm going to talk about both of them together, and that is the idea of simultaneous contrast, which is also called comparative contrast, and then gamut masking. Simultaneous contrast is helpful to us because when we look at some of these mixes, they can look rather muted depending on what's next to them. So if I were to only put these blues in front of you, they would look quite blue. But then if I were to put them next to Indanthrone blue here, can you see how, so these are the same as these two. Can you see how once I have Indanthrone blue here, which is a blue pigment, this starts to look more chromatic. This starts to look like more of a chromatic blue to us. As soon as we start to place colours next to each other and then compare them simultaneously. And then if I were to place ultramarine next to all of these would look even more muted. This would start to look like a muted blue, and then the ultramarine would be looking even more chromatic to us. So one way we can utilize simultaneous contrast in our paintings when we're considering mixing blue without blue is that we can plan a gamut mask considering whether or not we want to make this look as blue as possible. And to illustrate gamut masking, I'm going to be using this chart again, and I'm just going to get rid of this line here just to make it a little bit easier to show you what I'm about to show you. So when we create a limited palette, we are creating a gamut mask, whether you know it or not. And we can actually use that though by thinking about the gamut mask that we're making and what range of colours is going to be accessible to us as a result. So a gamut mask is taking the whole colour wheel and every colour accessible to us based on the pigments we have. So if these were all of the pigments I owned, then any of the colours that these would mix together are accessible to me if I were to use all of these in one painting. But if I were to only have a 3 pigment colour palette for a painting, so I'm going to do this example with dioxazine violet, phthalo green blue shade and azo orange, which is PO62, then what we end up happening is this. So we have our orange, our violet, and our green here, and I am now limited in this painting with only these 3 pigments to the colours inside this triangle. I have not only sliced off this section as we mentioned earlier, but I have sliced off all of this, and I have sliced off all of this. If I were to make a 4 pigment palette with a red, so let's say Pyrrole Scarlet, then what would happen is that the gamut mask would end up increasing to this. And if we were to remove that line, that is now, this square and what's inside it is now what is accessible to me in the painting when I use those 4 pigments. I've sliced off this area, this area, this area, and this area. It means that by mixing these 2 together, the most saturated chromatic pink or purple, well not purple, a pinky purple, red purple, I can get would be here. What I've done here is I've marked our kind of upper limit on the saturation of blue accessible to us in this 4 pigment limited palette. And if we were to only use these 4 colours, it may seem like, oh no, I'm not going to have access to these super bright punchy blues. But what can actually happen in creating this gamut mask is through simultaneous contrast, this blue can actually appear more blue to the viewer because these blues, the actual blues, ultramarine blue, Indanthrone blue, the more chromatic saturated blues are not included. They are not there to provide context to the brain that these are not saturated. Because these won't be included, these will look more blue to the viewer. This effect is something that can be seen in really, really famous limited colour palettes that are even more extreme than this. So a really good example of that is the Zorn palette, which I can't remember the exact pigments that are included in it right now, but it is a white, a black that has a cool leaning tone to it, which means that it is a black that leans more towards the blue side. And then it's a yellow ochre and then a warm red. And through only those 4 colours, Zorn was able to paint portraits, and he was able to produce tones that look bluish through the idea of simultaneous contrast and the creation of a colour gamut. If we were to look at Zorn's palettes for a moment, I'm going to get a different colour out. So this is red. We'll pretend that his black is like here, so a cool leaning black. And then he has a warm red. He has a yellow ochre, so it's not even going to be that saturated. I'll be lenient and say that it's reasonably saturated. And then he has white, which isn't on the chart, but whee, because I did this chart for watercolor, not opaque mediums. So he has access to some quite intense reds here, as you can see, some muted yellows, but then there's barely any access to blue at all. And what actually happens because of this is that this tiny leaning towards blue can actually look more blue to the viewer, but that effect would be entirely destroyed if any blue, like a cobalt blue, was placed next to this on a painting. This would just start to look grey or just black. It would lose that simultaneous contrast effect that makes it look so blue. And it's a really fascinating part of colour theory when you start to get into, again, the sort of more intermediate ideas involved. And if you want to know more about gamut masking in more detail than this, then James Gurney has some videos on it on his channel, and he also has some blog posts about gamut masking. But why is creating a colour gamut useful in the first place when you can just have every colour accessible to you and intentionally decide to make colours muted if you want to? Sure, you can do that if you want to. If you want to use 12 pigments, or if you want to use 48 pigments on one painting, you can. It's just that you're going to start increasing the challenge, the difficulty in creating a cohesive colour arrangement on the painting. If you create the colour gamut in advance by creating limited palettes where you know, right, okay, for this painting I want to have access to really bright greens but mute down this area instead, and have access to sort of a middle range for this colour. If you can go in and plan, even loosely, a colour gamut before going into a painting, you ease yourself when it comes to the actual painting in not having access to everything on the colour wheel, because you are able to naturally produce a cohesive painting in terms of colour by removing in advance everything else. So it makes the whole painting process a lot easier when you're actually painting, because you're not having to constantly think about manually muting everything down or manually making sure that you're not going too saturated for any one colour at any time when you have access to everything in front of you. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not saying that this is the only way to paint or the only right way to paint. There is no right way to paint. This is just a method that you can use, and if you find that you get overwhelmed with the amount of colours accessible to you when you're painting and you don't know how to manage the saturation and the muting of the colours, one way to potentially deal with that for you is to use colour gamuts like this and colour gamut masking like this. But on the other hand, if this seems too restrictive to you, or it removes the fun of painting to you, and you do prefer being more in the moment and having every colour accessible to you, and you manually spinning all the plates at once in your painting is something that you just enjoy, then obviously that is the best thing for you in your art practice, right? So there are no rules in art, only tools, and this is just one of many tools. So I hope that this kind of gives you a little dive deeper into colour theory than just your basic colour theory. There are a lot of layers to colour theory, like anything in art, so trying to fit too much information into one video was not my aim with this. I wanted to kind of give just a little peek further down than the basics. I hope that this was interesting or inspiring or helpful in some way to you. If you did find it helpful, then let me know in the comments. If you had no idea that you could mix blue and this was surprising to you, then let me know in the comments as well. But if you have already dived a little bit into this and you like to mix your own blues, your own reds and things like that, then let me know what your favourite mixes are in the comments as well. I would probably say that I'm like a 50-50 between the dioxazine violet and phthalo green blue shade ones here and the dioxazine violet and Viridian here. Boop. I'm between these two. This one gets way more dark valued, which is useful to me because I'm able to get like a nice range of blues then, range of values. But this one is just so pretty. So 50-50 between those two for me. But yes, I hope that this is interesting and I will see you next time. Bye!